Welcome to Road to Recovery.
Welcome to Road to Recovery, Advocacy and Insights for Trucking Accidents with Sagi Shaked. Sagi Shaked is the founder of Shaked Law, personal injury lawyers, and is ranked as one of the top 100 trial lawyers in the United States by the American Trial Lawyer Association. With a wealth of experience in personal injury, wrongful death, and complex litigation cases, he passionately advocates for victims and has recovered multi-million-dollar settlements and damages for his clients. I'm Lisa Mosbey, and today we're talking about neuropsychological testing and why these specialized evaluations can play such an important role in when someone is dealing with a traumatic brain injury and after a serious accident. Welcome, Sagi. This one's a little close for home for me. I've been in the shoes of the victim once before, so I'm interested to hear what you have to say about that today.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for having me. And yeah, we definitely interested to hear what happened to you also, as well as we talk about this stuff.
Sure. Sagi, what is neuropsychological testing? And why might someone with a traumatic brain injury be asked to go through this type of evaluation?
So, neuropsychological testing is an evaluation of how the brain is working, meaning the function of the brain. It doesn't look at brain structure as like a CAT scan would or an MRI would. It looks at the brain's function. Is the brain functioning? So, in simple terms, how is the person thinking? How is the person remembering, concentrating, processing information, and solving problems after an injury? So, when you think about a traumatic brain injury, they do all types of testing, memory testing, trouble concentrating, sometimes slower thinking, word finding problems, mood changes, difficulty organizing tasks, difficulty returning to work or school. So, uh, this is what neuropsychological testing really looks at. It's the function of the brain, not necessarily the structure. So, think about neuropsychological testing as impacting, does this person's brain function the way it used to?
Sure. And then what happens during an evaluation for neuropsychological testing? And what are the doctors actually measuring during that process?
So the testing, especially when you talk about traumatic brain injuries and you're talking about litigation, this testing is usually a day or two long, and it's a long day. So they start off with an interview where they ask you questions about your injury, what symptoms you're having, medical history, your education, your work history, emotional changes, and daily problems. And then they give you some standardized tests or a series of them. They're not tests that you would normally get at school. They're tests that are meant to test the function of the person's brain, depending on where the injury in the brain is. So some of them measure your attention, your ability to process speed, language, problem solving, decision making, planning, emotional functioning, visual, special skills, mental flexibility. Think about this. Sometimes you're in a test and they'll tell you, I want you to remember these three colors or these three things. And then they distract you for a little bit. And 3 minutes later, they'll say, do you remember the three things that I asked you? And it's stuff like that that they're see if your memory is really there. So the doctor is looking for patterns. Now, it's not whether the person passed or failed, because there really is no passing or failing. They're trying to look for what are the strengths and weaknesses with this person's function of brain, meaning what part of the brain got injured and how is that functioning. And it's always good if you had a baseline where you have people who know the person in the past and they know the person afterwards. So sometimes it's hard to tell, like if someone is really young and they got injured, you don't know what their baseline is. And people don't understand, why is the person not able to communicate the same? Why are they not have hand-eye coordination? Why are they slower in thinking? They don't have a baseline. But as the person gets older, you have some sort of baseline. You have an idea of where they were, and you can see how they've changed.
Yeah, I remember that experience. Hand-eye coordination was a big thing to relearn for me. Why are these evaluations sometimes necessary even when CT scans or MRIs do not show brain damage?
Yeah, so a lot of times, and this happens in what, the nomenclature right now is mild traumatic brain injury, moderate traumatic brain injury, and severe traumatic brain injury. And I hate that wording, but that's the wording that the doctors are using, and hopefully they'll get away from it. But in the mild traumatic brain injury, and again, it's only mild to the person who's not experiencing. The person who's experiencing the traumatic brain injury really suffers. Like, as you told us before we started the session, you had an injury, Lisa, when you were younger, and it took you a long time to really get a handle on certain things. And maybe you'll tell us about it if you want. You don't have to. But you can have a normal CT and a normal MRI, meaning they come back perfectly fine. But that does not mean the brain is functioning the way it did before. It just means that that picture on that CT is normal. But that doesn't mean that the function of the brain is normal. It just means structurally, you know, that brain looks normal. Or maybe if it's a mild traumatic brain injury, there's no fractures in the skull or there's no bleeding that you can see. Looks normal. You can have an MRI that looks normal, doesn't mean the person's brain functions normal, because there's different types of MRIs. And some MRIs, even with what they call diffuse tensor imaging, which looks for the white matter tracks, which is the connections in the brain, axons and neurons connecting, and there could be a disconnect there. Doesn't mean that the person is brain dead. It just means that there is a disconnect in the brain, in that portion of the brain. And if it deals with hand-eye coordination, there's that disconnect and it doesn't grow back. So you have that, and it takes the person a lot longer to get the answer out or to figure it out. So if you have, for example, an impact to the brain, this is where a neuropsych could help, and it's a processing issue. So a normal person or a person that hasn't had a traumatic brain injury might be able to recite the response right away. Whereas a person who has a brain injury, their axon and neurons, that connection isn't there. So they've got to go a longer way to figure it out. So I'm looking right now, if you're watching the podcast, you can see here, I want to scratch this left ear. A person that doesn't have a brain injury could easily touch their left hand with their left ear. But a person who has a brain injury has to go the long way and do it like this from their right hand to scratch their left ear. It just takes a lot longer. Or another example is if you're trying to get to a location and I block off all the major highways and it's an hour away, you could probably still get there. It's just on the highway, it'll take you, let's say, 40 minutes. On the regular side roads, it might take you an hour and a half. You're still getting to the location. It's just taking you a lot longer. And that's kind of the brain. When the brain has an injury to it, sometimes you can't see it. Or if I take a hose and I bend the hose in half, sometimes it stops the water. And if it stops the waters, the axons and neurons aren't connecting. And so there's a disconnect in the brain. So the neuropsychological testing will help us see better what the function of the brain was impacted. So that's kind of what we're looking for, even when you have a negative CAT scan and a negative MRI, because the literature from the American Congress of Physical Pain and Rehab, they tell you, even from the Veteran Affairs and from the CDC, you don't have to have a positive CT, a CAT scan, or a positive MRI to have damage in the brain. Those can be negative CT and a negative MRI and still have functional issues from an injury to your brain. So if you need that literature, I have it. Feel free to email me and I'll send it to you.
Beautiful. How long has this evaluation technology been around? Because this is not something that we've had for a long period of time, is it?
Right. So neuropsychological testing is evolving and it gets better over time. Now, it depends. Look, I can send you, Lisa, to a neuropsychologist now, and they'll say you're faking it because that's what these defense doctors do. I can write their reports, depending on which insurance company it is, or which defense lawyers hire them. I can write their reports, and they're always going to say the person is malingering or has secondary gain or somatoform. All those words are just fancy words that they've created to say the person is making this whole thing up. Remember, especially if the CT is negative or the MRI is negative, that's what the defense does. So sometimes it helps to have a good neuropsychologist on your side. So these exams, again, they could take a day to 2 days before you get something, and then they're not fond of sharing the raw data with us. They only want to share it with other neuropsychologists. There's all types of games that they play. So you have to be really careful when the defense hires one of these neuropsychologists because they're never going to find in your client's favor, no matter what the injury is.
Can you actually share an example of a case where neuropsychology or neuropsychological testing helped reveal the true extent of someone's brain injury, maybe including cognitive function, memory recall, or other things?
Yeah, absolutely. And this happens in a lot of our cases. We just went to trial on a case in January of 2026 where our client had a negative CAT scan and a negative MRI. And so you would think that they're perfectly fine. Well, what we knew from the neuropsychologist and from the family members that they weren't perfectly fine, that that was a different human being that showed up after that crash. They weren't the same. Give you an example. They were very forgetful. And what do I mean? Every single day, no matter how many times they left the house, they would always forget their keys. And this was like a constant theme that went on for this woman who, her husband testified to it, that she would constantly forget her keys no matter what happened. It just something that just didn't register in the brain that this is where she left her keys every single day. She would have to have sticky notes to help her remember certain things. And so everybody's affected differently. So it depends on what part of the brain got impacted. So if you have a frontal lobe, that impacts your emotions. So you have someone who is more emotional or someone that just cries a lot for no reason. Uh, no reason that a person who doesn't have a brain injury would expect. Or you can have a temporal lobe issue or they have hearing issues, right? And so every part of the brain affects a different part of the function of how that brain works. So we really would like to know what part of that brain got impacted. So I would love to have a positive or on that trial we had in January, we got a very good result. I think we 90x'd the offer, which was really good. So you would like to have positive imaging, but you don't always have it. So sometimes it helps to find out what part of the brain got impacted.
That's interesting because I think back to my experience, and I was so young. I was 3 years old when I ended up with a bruised brain, and by hit by a drunk driver and hit my head on the windshield. So I had a fractured skull and had issues related to that. But most of my life, I've had dizzy spells. I have hand-eye coordination. I was well into my 20s before I could even play pinball, which for a lot of kids, they walk up, it's natural. But I could not get that to work. I couldn't make my brain hit the ball with the flipper as it would come down. And it wasn't through, it was through accidental discovery that I was able to figure out how to make things work, how to get my brain to work for me. And then, the technology started to evolve, and we were able to learn more and more about how the brain will rewrite itself. It will, like you said, find different ways to do the same tasks. And then technology has come around. So here's the question: why do insurance companies sometimes challenge the results of these neuropsychological testing situations in brain injury in injury cases? Because we don't know all there is to know. Every time I got in a car until I was in my 20s, I would have panic attacks and be scared to death. There was an emotional component to getting into the vehicle. There was a fear that started at such a young age. We don't know. How do these insurance companies claim to know?
So remember, insurance companies are they want to keep their money and they just want to charge premiums and not pay out anything. So in every case that is a traumatic brain injury, they're always coming up with the person's exaggerating. It's not from this car crash or whatever it was. It's from their stress. It's from their anxiety. It's their depression. Oh, they had this pre-existing condition. That's what it's from. It's all in their head. Or they'll say the neuropsychologist testing is all subjective, or the person performed poorly on the exam. They didn't give effort. And remember, or the crash was not severe enough. Everybody's body is different, and you don't need. I know you had fractures. You told us when you were 3 years old, but you don't need a fracture to have a brain injury. You see it in the news a lot of times. The shaken baby syndrome. Where the person shakes their baby, and so you have what they call an acceleration deceleration type of injury. The brain is moving around, and they call that a coup contra coup type of injury. That can cause all those axons and neurons to be damaged. So you can have that, or you have our military personnel coming back from wars they've been in where there's blasts, but they didn't take a hit to the head, or, there's nobody that hit them specifically. It's just the sound waves impacted their brain. And so that can happen too. So the insurance companies, their position is, we can't see it. It's not like a broken leg, something you can see. So the person's faking it. They're exaggerating it. So they don't want to pay claims. So it's our job as lawyers to bring it to life. And that's why you don't need just a positive MRI or a CT scan. Now, it's helpful, but it's not the be all end all. The neuropsychological testing can help, but there's a bunch of other tests that a person can do, like a QEEG or a VNG. There's ocular motor studies where you can test the eye and see if it's following lines or following in a circle. There's different types of testing that you can do to help substantiate what the individual who suffered the injury is going through, to determine, again, is it hand-eye coordination issues? Is it slower thinking or processing issues? Everybody reacts differently on depending how their brain is injured. And some people bounce back, but they're never going to be 100%. The insurance companies want us to believe it, and they'll publish articles out there wanting people to believe that, but that's just not the way the human brain works. Yeah, you can bounce back and still be a productive member of society, but you still have some deficits. And sometimes the people who know that best are the family members. They can see it on the person.
Yeah. So, why can this type of testing become so important when building evidence in a traumatic brain injury case, and how do you use it?
Yeah, so think about a traumatic brain injury. It's an invisible damage case, right? The person looks normal, they sound normal, they talk normal. Again, I'm looking at you, Lisa, and I have no idea that you had a skull fracture when you were young. I had no idea that it took you almost till 30 to get the driving down pat. I have no idea that all those things happened to you because it's the invisible injury. It's not something obvious. You don't have a scar on your, some people have surgery on their hands or legs and you see scars. This is the invisible injury, so they take advantage of it. The person looks normal. The scans are normal. The defense doctor is saying everything's normal with them. What else are they going to say, right? Um, but that's why that neuropsychological testing can be helpful with the right neuropsychologist to determine how that, with the testing that they do, how that brain injury really affected function. And so, and with before and after witnesses. So, how did it affect the injured person? How does it affect their communication on the job? How does it affect their communication with their family, with their coworkers? Having that in place, the before and after witnesses with your life care planners and your treating doctors can really help the jury understand what they're going through. So your client doesn't sound like they're complaining all the time. You have people who explain their story and brings to life a lot better what they went through. So I'll give you an example. We had a client who was a math whiz. He worked in a wholesale of imports and exports. And in his warehouse that he used to work at all the time, he would be able to calculate stuff without using a calculator. And we had witnesses to that effect. He would be able to multiply four numbers times four numbers, which is, that's a pretty wild thing to do, off the top of your head and just as fast as a calculator. That's how fast his mind worked. But after the injury to the brain, and it was one that came back negative on a CAT scan and negative on an MRI, he wouldn't be able to do that. He just wasn't able to process that information anymore. Um, and his daughter had the same gift he did, but obviously she didn't have the injury. He had the injury. And so his warehouse employees were able to tell us how they were fascinated by him before, and he just couldn't do this kind of stuff. So we were able to show that was one symptom of the injury that he had to his brain, even though everything came back normal. So we're able to show that that function in his brain just didn't work anymore. So everybody's different and everybody's brain gets impacted differently and everybody has a different life experience. So you really, as a lawyer, have to dig down, figure out how your client's been impacted, and not just ask the client, but really ask their family members, ask their coworkers. We've had a client who became withdrawn, socially withdrawn, just didn't want to hang around with people. They just wanted to be by themselves. They would eat by themselves when they normally like to eat with people or go to barbecues and just wanted to be by themselves. The brain injury affects everybody differently. So everybody has a different story. Hopefully that answered your question.
It did, and I know that we're coming to an end, and I don't want to wrap this up. Sagi, this has been a fabulous. I might be biased, but I thought this was a great educational interview. So thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate you
Thanks,
going
Lisa.
into the
Thank
details.
you.
Mhm. Folks, that's it for today's episode of Road to Recovery, Advocacy and Insights for Trucking Accidents. If you'd like to learn more about Sagi Shaked and his work at Shaked Law, Personal Injury Lawyers, visit shakedlaw.com. You'll find resources to help you understand your rights after a serious trucking accident and what it takes to protect your future. Thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave us a review if you found this episode helpful. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.